Hey, it's the way we were raised in the places we stayed in. We stand up and breaking the chains that we came in enslaved generations. They made a great nation. They can't find a place and we're racist to hate 'em. Yes. Welcome to Hidden History, Episode 1. Hidden History explores how the ruling classes throughout history divide people, rewrite history, and privatize resources and influence. We'll start with the history we were taught in America. Now, if you're like Morgan Freeman,
I don't want a Black History Month.
You may be wondering why we need a Black History Month.
Ridiculous. Why?
It's because of hidden history. Here's the history we were taught in schools, and that was reinforced with pop culture. Humans evolved in Africa and migrated around the world. And while the rest of the world evolved and built civilizations, Africa is full of simple and savage tribes who are uncivilized heathens with no writing, living in mud huts. Miraculously, the white race developed science, medicine, math, astronomy, architecture, and philosophy all by themselves, and then created Judeo-Christianity. Then they sailed the world bringing the love of Jesus, liberty, and free markets to people all around the world with one little bad thing, which was slavery, but it was pretty common at the time anyway, so small price to pay, right? Plus, they should all be grateful because after that, the so-called white race ended slavery and treated everyone fair by the 1960s when racism officially ended, right?
Oh, you better believe it.
You said what?
Heritage, not hate.
Yeah, except that's not true history. It wasn't until many of us were in college or as adults doing our own research where we found so many events that were deliberately buried and kept from the public eye to be forgotten. But before we get into that, we have to ask who taught us this history. Meet the Blue Bloods. Now, they've been called many things. This is just one of their nicknames, but to understand their history, we must go back to early European history. Since before the time of Rome, this aristocratic class of elites had been playing kingmakers as bankers, senators, and tycoons. Because they were always scheming on more power and money behind closed doors, rather than working outdoors like the commoner, people started calling them blue bloods, as their skin became more pale and you could see their veins through their skin due to the lack of sun exposure. They also saw their own blood as different and intermarried with other blue blood families so that they could consolidate collective wealth and influence and pass it on through their children. This group of elites saw themselves as better than the plebes and used propaganda to divide the poor people of Europe into a feudal caste system where the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. Sound familiar?
The Republicans.
Democrats. No, it's the Democrats.
These ultra-rich landowners already had servants and slaves who were poor Europeans. It was not the same. Nah, you're right, but my point is, this is the same type of ultra-rich class that started the transatlantic slave trade. So they could get fat, drunk, and rich off of the sugar, chocolate, rum, and tobacco at the expense of the European and now African slaves. And this brings us to one of our first hidden facts. So-called whites are not responsible for slavery.
Nah, hold on, man. You going too far.
Whoa. Hey, hear me out. First, you have to remember that not only has slavery been going on since the dawn of humanity, during these times, there is no such thing as white people. At this time in Europe, you have an interconnected world of Irish, English, Spanish, French, German, etc., people with their own complicated history and beefs. They were all speaking different languages and coming from different legacies. And they were all treated the same by their ruling class. So, slavery and a ruling class existed before the term white race was even coined to clump all Europeans into one body. This ultra-rich class saw themselves as a different breed of human. They didn't even see other European commoners as part of them. They didn't include them in the decision-making process.
Heritage, not hate.
Man, wait. You trying to tell me the poor white people had nothing to do with slavery?
No. After centuries of this royal blue blood aristocracy and nobles, commoners in Europe began rising up and beheading kings left and right in increasing incidents. The blue bloods knew they had to change and could no longer flaunt their wealth and influence. But they still needed a workforce of commoners to stay rich. I mean, that's how they became known as blue bloods after all. All that shade. That shade, though. So, to keep European commoners on their side and to motivate them to join their efforts for spoils, they needed something to foster white buy-in from other Europeans for unity and a common promise of wealth. And thus, Manifest Destiny was born. A new doctrine that says because the white race is better than all other races, all white people have the right to establish their dominance and their way of life on the colored savages of the world. God himself permitting them to take their land, resources, rape and enslave them because even if you weren't born royal like the blue bloods, you were still white, so every man a king of his castle. This campaign was largely successful, and white buy-in to the Manifest Destiny dream was like a new holy crusade rallying a race to the frontiers. So even though poor so-called whites were not responsible for slavery, their buy-in and support was absolutely necessary to expand it to America. But keep in mind, they were also America's first major labor force in servitude.
See, I told you. Most of us aren't even descendants of slave owners. Heritage, not hate.
Well, yes, but you have to remember, when we first reached the shores of America, it was not a democracy. It was financed and completely run by the aristocrats. To do the hard work as usual, they relied on poor European indentured servants at first. Then later, it was mostly African slaves. So these aristocrats who were rich and influential back in Europe, now they have an entire population of poor, uneducated European and African laborers. So they were in a unique position to teach us a specific brand of history, nationalism, and science in a new form of public education. And even though the aristocrats are teaching their alternate history to a divided multicultural America, and they still have all the decision-making power, slavery is about to end. When the African and European workforce began finding common ground in their frustrations with the aristocracy, it led to uprisings like Bacon's Rebellion, where free blacks and poor whites joined together, shut down the government, and took land from natives and wealthy landowners. Now, this really scared the aristocracy, as they feared things like the French and Haitian Revolution, so they needed a way to re-educate and divide the common workforce. They wanted to teach their uneducated population white identity and black and native inferiority. How did they do it? Well, for the public school system, the main goals were to create a sense of nationalism, a common narrative and customs shared by all American civilians who at this point were mostly immigrants. Outside of the public school system, create a sense of white identity through legal advantages and perceived superiority over the other races to maintain white buy-in, giving them the illusion that you can be blue blood like us. And things like blackface parties. The second goal was to create a sense of black inferiority. This would serve as justification for their injustices, i.e., why treat non-humans like humans? so that white people would buy in without considering black people's suffering because they weren't exactly human. Science and evolution models supported these racist claims. Another crucial element was the theme of uncivilized Africa. These themes were made intrinsically popular in pop culture through things like human zoos and propaganda pieces to incite fear and foster white rage against blacks. We can see that the denial of pre-colonial African kingdoms and painting them as savages is to justify slavery and to promote racial hierarchies, while at the same time denying all the major contributions to what would later be called Greek sciences. It also hides the fact that there was already an intercontinental free trade system through Africa reaching as far as India, through the islands, all the way to the Americas, before European colonization destroyed it and replaced it with its own Eurocentric trade. And finally, not recognizing Africa's nations as sovereign and its people not as people, the Blue Bloods could justify carving up the continent like a turkey for their own wealth. White identity and supremacy attempts to shift the blame away from the Blue Bloods to the poor and common whites who they've been enslaving even before Africans. Get whites to buy into this shared identity and the perks that it brings. That way, they will defend everything associated with their new whiteness and absorb the backlash for the Blue Bloods and stand between them and the blacks by striking up fear of black sexuality and blacks taking away their economic and political power so that they can incite white rage mobs against blacks. Now, buy-in to the white identity was crucial, so along with scientific articles justifying racial stereotypes and films like Birth of a Nation further served to depict blacks as sexually obsessed brutes, when, despite at this time, they had been raped more than any other people on the continent. This formula of white rage based on protecting the purity of the white woman from black men would be the cause for many massacres and lynchings over the decade. But this brings us to our third hidden truth. Many so-called white people resisted white privilege and discriminatory laws. History hides the fact that even as soon as white identity laws went into effect, many whites who lived and worked amongst the blacks protested these new laws. Large numbers of poor whites did not accept these changes and often fled with blacks. This is why it's so hard to answer, is America a racist nation? Because you have a large group that show solidarity and join us to win rights. And then after that, the racist group who was in denial and against us both will be the first to look at the outcome we struggled for and say,
You see, aren't you lucky to be American? See, this country is fair.
Oh, hell!
If you think it's racist, you should leave.
Anyway, the stories of the white allies are hidden to promote the us versus them mentality and to stoke white guilt and black victimhood. To get blacks to forget their pre-colonial history and heritage, to teach them their own inferiority, and to stifle their sense of black determinism in favor of a welfare state by using the federal government to save them from crises the ruling class themselves created in the first place. Examples of this. During the Reconstruction period, media companies incited a white rage mob to overthrow an interracial government. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, the media incited a white rage mob based on the sexual brute trope and used them to destroy Black Wall Street, which was a powerful independent black economy, pulled up by its own bootstraps. And finally, after an aggressive media campaign to discredit them, they used the FBI to dismantle or even to assassinate members of the Black Panther Party and other ethnic self-determination movements who were addressing the gaps and disparities in their own community. Now, all of the responses by the government had the outcome as so that the people of color would have to depend on the federal government instead of taking their destiny into their own hands. From this pattern, we see that the two main weapons against blacks since the fall of the old Jim Crow is media perception that either stirs up white rage or justifies the black circumstance. And second, it's Trojan horses from the government presented in order to save blacks, like the war on drugs, affirmative action, and the first minimum wage laws. Each campaign further increasing unemployment, incarceration, and homicides amongst blacks, and contributing to the continual conditioning of inferiority and victimhood since the African slave trade began. We have the same enemy pitting us against each other. It's time to come together. Cause y'all was out of pocket in 2020, y'all.
Yeah, well, I guess.
Y'all know that, right? Do you know that y'all was tripping?
See what had happened was
That was my cataract. Mega Man, just because you're white, whatever that is, that doesn't make you responsible or a beneficiary of slavery, especially if you work towards unity. But if you claim allegiance to the white power structure and say things like,
and we refuse to apologize for creating the modern world.
And if you choose to stand with the blue bloods against the global majority, then that's on you. And if you're black and you use the pain our ancestors went through as a crutch or an excuse, but you don't also take up their struggle and work for a better tomorrow, if you say you're black so you can't be racist, but you tear down every black leader that tries to build something, or you don't show support to your community, or you use street violence for clout to contribute to America's black body count legacy, then that's on you. In closing, if you think you're helping to end racism by simply saying stop talking about it without addressing the hidden history and the lies that continue to pit people against each other, then you are defending the blue bloods, allowing them to continue dividing us and working from the shadows to consolidate global resources and power while we bicker over party lines. No more. Let's drop the right and left, black and white identity politics that we've been taught respectively over 100 years. Let's prove to these blue bloods that we're not too dumb to rule ourselves, that we don't need them manipulating our perceptions and our destiny. Well, free folk, I'm Freedom Reign. Please join us for the next episode of Hidden History. And remember, Carthage must be restored.